Zero tolerance. It's a phrase that has made its way into the popular lexicon, a policing strategy that led to tens of thousands of illegal arrests here in Baltimore and was blamed in part by the Justice Department for the ongoing illegal practices of the police department. And the policy of making petty arrests for spitting on the sidewalk or drinking a beer focused almost exclusively on the African-American community. A fact that some people says means that zero tolerance was not just illegal and ineffective, but actually responsible for the persistent violence and poverty that continues to afflict Black communities in the city. So how did zero tolerance affect Baltimore? And what are the long-term implications of its implementation here? To help me sort this out, we're talking to two reporters who covered zero tolerance at its height and wrote about it extensively. Luke Broadwater is an award-winning investigative reporter for the Baltimore Sun, but previously he worked for the now-defunct Baltimore Examiner. And his former Examiner colleague and Emmy-winning reporter, Real News reporter Stephen Janis, also joins us. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Thank you, Taya.
So, Stephen, I'll start with you.
Okay.
We don't have many firsthand accounts of how zero tolerance affected the community. Could you tell us a little bit about your reporting?
Well, you know, I think one of the interesting things that Luke and I always talk about when we started covering the Examiner was the absolute quantity of arrests. It's hard to understand, I think, for people who live in communities that aren't policed the way Baltimore is, to understand that you could literally walk outside your door and be arrested for absolutely nothing. In other words, there were people who were known as the jump out boys because they would come into neighborhoods the night before Comstat, which is where they sort of quantify and measure all the arrests, and literally like walk people in African-American neighborhoods, poor African-American neighborhoods, in the back of their van, back of a van for doing nothing. And then there were so many people, and there's so many people they were trying to process at central booking, which is where all the people were brought for arrest. They had something called a walkthrough, which is where instead of actually being incarcerated, you simply just walk through, so they would get the arrest and it would be recorded as a statistic, but the person wasn't actually incarcerated.
So is this the abated by arrest that you
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the
on?
concept,
Okay.
was abated by arrest. That, in other words, a cop would see someone spitting or sitting on a stoop or doing whatever, and they'd arrest them, and then prosecutors, and Luke will talk about that later, he did a big investigation of that. But the point was the psychology of the city was like literally lunacy. You had 10,000 people being arrested on a monthly basis, totally like, you know, sort of responding to the statistical need to incarcerate people. But neighborhoods were pretty much under martial law. It was a horrible, horrible situation, and people suffered.
So, Luke, tell us a little bit about your reporting. What did you report on in relation to zero tolerance in Baltimore City?
Well, one of the first stories I did concerned the concept of release without charges. This is something that was happening to 20,000 or even 30,000 people a year in Baltimore. Those are people who are arrested, they're taken downtown, they're maybe held all weekend if they're arrested on a Friday night, and then they're released. They don't know why they were arrested, they're never told, and they're never charged with anything. As someone who had covered the criminal justice system elsewhere, when I first came and started covering Baltimore at the Examiner with Stephen, I was sort of shocked that this was even a process. What do you mean released without charge? What do you mean arrested people without charges? And so, of course, then when I started digging into it more, I started going to the other jurisdictions and saying, do you have this? How many do you have? And for Harford County, for instance, I believe had 2 people arrested without charges, not 30,000. Right. Howard County had 0 people arrested without charges. It was almost a foreign concept, this idea that you could arrest people without ever telling them what the charge is, without ever getting a prosecutor to sign off on it, or having evidence and facts to back up what you say. And this is much different than being charged and then having the prosecutors drop the charges, right? That's a different process. This is people who are released with never actually being charged, and it was happening to tens of thousands of people every year in Baltimore.
I remember when Luke was working the story, there was this guy down at a corrections official down in Florida, and we called him and we asked him about, do you have abated by arrest? And he goes, what's that? I go, well, it's something we have here, abated by arrest, where you get arrested but you're not charged and you're let go. And he'd never heard of the concept, and a lot of people I think it's, I'm not totally sure of this, but I think it's something that was invented in Baltimore, and it was a means of social control. You know, we see you on the corner, we arrest you, and as Luke said, it's like a foreign concept to other, you know, law enforcement agencies. They had never heard of something like this.
So this policy at its peak, over 100,000 people were arrested per year. How do you think this affected the community?
Well, like I said before, I think it was beyond just a criminal justice issue. It became a psychological issue. I mean, I think you had an entire community under siege, a community that was constantly being disrupted. You can imagine if you're a person or an individual looking for a job or trying to work your way out of the, entrenched poverty in the city, that if you got arrested, 5 or 6 times a year for absolutely nothing, how it would disrupt your life, how it would disrupt your family, how, as Luke said, you could end up being central booking for a weekend or even longer because you don't know what the bail the person's going to say. It's completely random. So I think what you had was, some of the problems that we were trying to solve in the city, entrenched poverty, violence, I think it ended up exacerbating them because, it was basically like we were in a Soviet bloc nation. You could be detained and arrested, as Luke said, without, that is like so un-American. I mean, what Luke is saying is like absolutely unconstitutional. You're always supposed to know why you're being arrested. You're supposed to be charged. But in this in Baltimore City, in the confines of the city, you literally could be detained, your freedom taken away without any cause. And that is something I think that is traumatic for people. You got to think about it. It engendered long-term, I think, psychological effects.
Well, Stephen, you also wrote about one of the most egregious examples of zero tolerance, the arrest of a 7-year-old boy named Gerard Mungo. He was arrested for simply sitting on a dirt bike. Now, can you tell us about your interview with him when he was a little child and your interview with him years later?
Well, I mean, that case became emblematic in some ways of the excesses of zero tolerance. There was a young man named Gerard Mungo who was sitting on his dirt bike waiting for his father to pick him up, and the police came and confiscated his dirt bike. And brought the child inside to his mother and said, you can't be on dirt bikes. And they took it. So the mother called the supervisor to complain. And all this came out in a lawsuit later. He had just turned 7. He was 6, just turned 7. So the mother calls the supervisor to complain, and they get on the phone with each other, and they decide they're going to arrest him to retaliate for the fact that the mother complained to the supervisor about taking the dirt bike. So they come in and they handcuff him. This kid, I mean, he's literally, Luke worked on this story too. He's literally like a child. The handcuffs don't even fit. And they bring him down to juvie booking and interrogate him. And finally he is released. And we went to interview him and, he started to cry. And it became sort of a worldwide story and very interesting because it sort of exposed the absurdity. Like, what kind of society would arrest a 7-year-old? What kind of city would think that this were any productive outcome to arresting a 7-year-old? He was traumatized, and I actually talked to him about a year ago, and he's still traumatized. But I think it was one of those cases where, and actually the mayor, Sheila Dixon at that time, actually came out and publicly said it was wrong. So it was sort of, the first case where it was just so extreme, that people finally said, wow, this is really absurd. People who had probably not cared about it before.
What kind of feedback did you get for this story?
Well, there was a lot of hate mail and a lot of people saying the kid was a drug dealer, was going to be a drug dealer, and very, very, very hostile towards the kid. And that's the way a lot of this stuff, and I'm sure Luke can talk about it, when we write zero tolerance stories, that he would, people would respond in really horrible ways about it because they really thought, the city was crime infested and there was no other alternative.
Now, Luke, you did a story which caused quite a stir within the police department. You did an investigation where you surveyed experts who said that zero tolerance was actually being botched. What did you uncover?
That's right. So what we saw in Baltimore was Governor O'Malley, then Mayor O'Malley, had gone to New York, and he had tried to bring down New York's zero tolerance strategies and implement them in Baltimore. Some people call this the broken windows style of policing, where the idea is that if you catch a turnstile jumper or someone who breaks a window, likely they've done 10, 20 other bad things, and you're going to get them on, oh, wow, they also have a warrant out for shooting someone. But what we saw in Baltimore is what these experts said was a misuse of that practice, that they were simply locking up whole blocks of people, driving around, arresting people seemingly at random, which is what the prosecutor's, Patricia Jessamy's office said was happening. And in fact, now we see the Department of Justice report agrees was happening. It's not the proper use of the broken windows theory. And as we reported this story and called multiple people who agreed with that, we got a lot of pushback from the Baltimore Police Department, a lot of anger and personal attacks. But at the same time, I'll say we got a lot of support from the community. I remember Stephen and I and others at the Examiner as well would go to various events and they would say, thank you for telling the story the right way. For years we've been made to appear to be all criminals, or everyone out here, every young man is doing something wrong. And that's not the case. Many of these guys are being arrested for little or no reason, and their lives are being knocked off course. If you're arrested over the weekend, you can't go to work. Well, guess what? You might lose your job. You can't study for that big test or whatever if you're arrested. So now you're falling behind in school, you're missing class. So it did have a residual impact on people's lives. Also, when you're in jail, you tend to meet guys you wouldn't necessarily meet otherwise. You can be grouped in with people and learn bad habits that you wouldn't necessarily if you were out in front of your mom's house. So it had this spiraling effect, and I'm glad we're talking about this today because the Department of Justice report, which just came out recently, said all of these things, and I felt like we were reporting on this stuff a decade ago, and it sort of brought it all home and said, yes, that was one of the origins of our modern day crisis.
It got so absurd, we were talking about Gerard Mungo, and 2 weeks after Gerard Mungo was arrested, they arrested his mother. They broke down the door in his aunt's house and chasing someone, illegal entry, and then decided to arrest his mother. And I was down at Central Booking waiting for her to come out. And I'm behind Central Booking, and there's a guy in a wheelchair coming out. And I'm like, what happened to you? And he's like, I got arrested. I said, why did you get arrested? And he goes, because I was drinking a beer outside my house. I said, but you're in a wheelchair. He's like, yeah, they brought in this special truck, and they hoisted me up, and they arrested me. They arrested a guy in a wheelchair for drinking a beer. That's how, it was almost like trawling for people, the way, when you fish and you have a trawler, not a net, or literally just bringing in anyone they could. And what Luke was talking about, yeah, it was like people, you might have a job and you get out 3 or 4 days later and you've lost that job. So it was deeply affected the city.
So the Department of Justice report has shown that our police department has illegally and unconstitutionally arrested people. How much do you think is the legacy of zero tolerance playing in here?
Luke, you want to?
Well, I think it's I don't think it's the sole cause, but it's one of the very large causes of the disconnect between the community and the police. I do think larger concepts such as the drug war as a whole are into play, but the zero tolerance is really the ramped up effort of the drug war. I mean, really, who are the people they're supposedly going after? It's supposedly the drug dealers, right? It's the people whose drug fueled wars cause the shootings, right? So when you ramp that up to its logical conclusion, now you're arresting everybody. And so, this isn't me saying it, this is the Department of Justice who pointed the finger squarely at the policies of former Mayor O'Malley. And, former Governor O'Malley apparently still thinks these are the right policies because as little as 2 years ago, he was publicly arguing with the current mayor, who's his longtime ally, that she wasn't arresting enough people. So, I mean, this is, almost a decade later, he still believes that was the right thing to do.
I think one thing I want to add to what Luke said, I do think that the culture that was created by zero tolerance, where people were being judged, Luke and I did stories about arrest quotas, where we got a hold of documents that showed that they literally had quotas. Like every district and every unit in that district was judged by literally the number of arrests. So that culture of stats, making certain number, the arrest in of itself, doesn't matter who you arrest or for what reason, I think continued to persist. They had VSET, which was a violent impact crimes division, which was kind of zero tolerance in a bottle, which went around and did the same thing. And I think they really believed that if you went into a neighborhood and arrested 30 people, that's what you did when there was a homicide there, because that's the way to stop the violence. So I think it created a culture that carried on and certainly informed the Justice Department report. Okay,
well, this is the last question, and I'll pose it to both of you. What do you think has been the long-term impact of the zero tolerance policy?
Well, I really believe that the violence it was purporting to solve, it actually had an effect of exacerbating it. I think by disrupting people's lives, by making it difficult, giving them arrest records where they can't get a job, by turning neighborhoods into literally, war zones where you have a military occupying force, I think you have made people more violent. I think it literally is the reason that Baltimore continues to lag the nation in decrease in homicides and why we still have this legacy of violence. So I think it really did the exact opposite of what Martin O'Malley and the people who use this policy promised would do. And I think that's the long-term legacy.
And I would say the other legacy is that it had a fundamental effect of changing how the police do their jobs. By relying on this data, what gets tracked and what gets measured is what gets done. And by making arrests the primary goal of the police officer, you promote a perverse incentive to that has a very damaging impact with the community. It would be interesting to see if whether other measures could be used, like, I don't know, positive interaction with a citizen. Do you get rewarded for that or something? But the legacy has not been a good one, according to the Department of Justice. And I think that Governor O'Malley, what he points to when he talks about this stuff is he points to there was a reduction in murders during this time, and he sees that as a positive thing. So I will say that that's his point of view, but the Department of Justice has clearly said that the larger story is while murders did go down temporarily and now they've come back up, the rift between the community and the police was vastly hurt.
And one thing Luke brought up is important in terms of the community. You know, the community was concerned about this, and other than us writing about the Examiner, it was kind of ignored by other media, other than if we did a story. And I think the community, I think that's create deep wounds in the community in terms of like the media and other people not responding to the concerns and just prosecuting this police policy, which was ultimately destructive.
One thing, if I could just make, there's one great story we didn't talk about, which was Stephen did a story called "Why Did They Arrest Me?"
Oh yeah.
And he interviewed people. I think you had 5 case
Five
studies.
different people, yeah.
Because we can talk about 100,000 people arrested every year, but when you saw people who were getting arrested for having a backyard barbecue, or for spitting on the sidewalk on a hot day,
and the guy from Hopkins coming out of his porch to see what was happening.
Right. Then it really strikes home the absurdity of some of these arrests, and you can't say, well, they're locking up bad guys when.
No, they were just normal people. I guess,
Right.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Wasn't there a pastor couple that was arrested? The
was
wife was made to walk home by
Yeah, the
herself?
pastor was arrested on his way to church, and they arrested him and left his wife on the sidewalk. And
To walk home by herself. Yeah. Thank you both so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Taya.
This is Taya Graham reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland.